Hi, and welcome to Module 2.3, Roles and Responsibilities. As always, we'd like to thank Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation for supporting this course through the project Community-Led Design for Specialized Housing in the North, and to acknowledge the partnership that makes this certificate possible between Together Design Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University, Nishnawbe Aski Nation, the Faculty of Community Services at Toronto Metropolitan University, and WASA Distance Education Center. In this module, we're still hard at work understanding the project that we're building and answering the questions that need to be answered before we can assemble the tender package itself. As you'll have no doubt already noticed, much of the hard work of tendering and procurement happens long before there is a tender package, making sure that the project is properly understood and that the tender package you move forward with is the right one for your project. In this module, we look to answer a few pretty simple questions. What are the common roles and responsibilities in a construction project? Why is it important to define and communicate those roles? And what are the roles played by different professionals or professional organizations that are specific and may require specific training or authorization in order to be able to carry out those roles? First, let's make sure we're getting some really basic terms right. Roles are the official titles or jobs that someone is given within a project. And those can be both internal or external. And when they are external, they're often formalized through a contract or some other document that clearly outlines what that title's responsibility brings with us. And that brings us to responsibility. Those are the duties, tasks, and requirements that are going to be taken up through a project. And while formal roles may matter and the titles that come along with them are important, it's equally important to make sure that all of the duties and tasks that need to be fulfilled during a tendering and procurement process are clearly defined and assigned to someone. Often, in getting held up with roles and titles, we miss out on some of the important responsibilities and just assume based on titles who's going to be fulfilling them without ever properly outlining who's going to be taking up that task. So, depending on the project delivery method and contract type, the roles may vary. Not every project has the same responsibilities, tasks, or titles that need to be filled. And wherever possible, you want to be as clear as you can about who's going to take up a particular role and a task. Now, you may think that this is particularly important when someone external is going to fill that role. And often, contracts can dictate those when they are external. But at least in my experience, some of the biggest trouble actually comes when a variety of roles and responsibilities are being filled internally to the First Nation. Often because in that case there aren't so many contracts and there hasn't been so much prolonged negotiation, there can actually be even less clarity about who's going to play what role. And that's really when assumptions get made, maybe based on past projects or based on other organizational responsibilities that people have. But even when those roles are being filled internally, and we'll talk more throughout this module about the breakdown of internal and external roles, you want to make sure that you're really clearly communicating who's doing what. And one of the reasons to do that, one of the reasons to make sure that everybody on the team understands not just their role, but who's fulfilling other roles that interact with theirs and their responsibilities, is to reduce risk. One of the biggest risks that occurs in a project is uncertainty and having people call around, having people make decisions that are outside of their particular responsibilities because they aren't certain, having some decisions be duplicated because more than one person feels responsible can, in the long term, increase the costs, delay the project, and even create some legal tensions for you. So What needs to be understood here in the assigning of roles and responsibilities is that everyone's mandate is clear, and that everyone's mandate is clear to everyone else, and that there are no responsibilities that haven't been mandated at all. So what you see on screen right now is some of the typical roles that need to be filled within a construction project. Now, I want to be clear, what we're showing on screen isn't what we're suggesting the kind of tree or diagram for your project should look like, but instead just giving an example of how you might imagine a kind of roles and responsibilities diagram playing out. And I would encourage you, as you're doing this, to kind of sketch out for yourself what those kind of reporting relationships look like, or decision-making relationships, and even consider sharing this with your project team so that, as I said in the last slide, you create certainty not just for yourself as the potential project manager or the person responsible for leading tendering and procurement, but that you create certainty for everyone involved in the project. So let's again revisit this concept of internal versus external roles. Now, it's possible for just about every role in this project to be filled internally or externally. And by internally, we mean either with current staff already with the First Nation, or new hires that you might be looking to add because of this project. Often, though, when we think of moving externally with a role, you're doing it for one of two reasons. One is that you don't have the capacity in your organization's internal structure already to be able to take on that role or those responsibilities within the project. And so you may look outside to grow your team and to ensure that there's someone totally focused on this work. The second reason, and we'll get into this more later in the module, is that there might be some specific tasks that require qualifications that you may not have and that you may not require on a kind of full-time basis internal to your organization. And so for those roles with specific qualifications, it may often be prudent, if you're not taking on the number of projects that would allow you to employ someone full-time in that role, to look externally. Let's get into what some of the specific titles are that are going to be used not just in this module, but throughout the course. The first is the owner. And here, when we're talking about the owner, it's the person who's responsible for the project. Oftentimes, in the context that we're working in, the owner is the First Nation itself, and thus represented by the chief and council. They are the ultimate decision makers on the project. And the owner can take on additional roles depending on the type of contract type you're looking for. But the thing to remember is that the decision-making tree always points up towards this owner. Now, with some projects, and we'll talk about this more as we go, the owner can appoint an agent to represent them, to act on their behalf. And this can be someone internal. You might think in many cases this is a housing manager, a public works manager, or whatever the title might be. They can, or the kind of project lead, special project lead is something you hear as well a lot. And when the chief and council appoint that person to be responsible for the project, they internally and in everyone they work with on this project become the representative of the owner. Now, there are also cases, and this is even more common in larger projects, though there's no reason why it can't happen even a small project. The community and the community's leadership may choose to appoint someone external as the representative of the owner. And that can be someone who you've worked with for a long time, and so you have a trusting relationship with them, or depending on the contract type and the arrangement of the project team, it can be someone totally new to you, but who acts as a client representative throughout the project. The role of the owner that you see on screen here is obviously initiating the project. It's theirs, and so they have to kind of kick it off. They're the ones who are bringing the idea forward, but they're also, throughout the project, responsible for making the critical decisions that are both financial. Obviously, what's most important to us in this case, the kind of tendering and contractual decisions will reside with them, but other decisions, and you see a number of them listed here throughout the project, the responsibility of decision making rests with the owner. A general contractor, and now we're getting into kind of more specific construction roles. The general contractor is usually the person responsible for overseeing the day-to-day of the building project. And sometimes when we're talking about a construction project, as we are here, and as we have also in the other course we've brought forward on project management, we can get confused between what's happening day to day on the job site in the construction of the house. We sometimes get that confused with the project itself, but there is a wider project that's being managed. However, the general contractor's focus is limited to the construction project. And so you can see some other names here that are commonly used in the industry: the prime contractor, the building contractor. What those terms suggest, and what I'm trying to get across to you here, is that when you hear general contractor, you should always be thinking about the building site and the construction, and not things to do with the wider project administration. Now, the kind of flip to that is the project manager, who's responsible for the planning, the coordination, the administration of the project. Very often when we're talking about a project manager, we're not talking about someone who has the day-to-day responsibility on the building site. Instead, we're talking about the administration of the project and the project team. Next, and maybe combining the two a little bit, would be the idea of a construction manager. Now, a construction manager is typically used in these kind of, or can typically be used in these kind of smaller scale projects when one person is responsible for both the administration and the construction on the site. And so often, if this is someone internal to the First Nation, this is going to be someone who has experience both on the job site day to day and working in the office, moving the project along. This can, in a kind of smaller residential project like this, require a higher capacity and an ability to work with various different types of people to move a project forward. Totally different from those roles is an architect. And this is when we start to move into some of the more specialized roles, and we'll go through these and how they impact your process, where qualifications are going to be required in order to place certain functions within the project. So the architect can be responsible for the design and development of construction drawings. So that's what are you building, and the construction specifications. And that's what are you building it with. And this is a highly specialized role that has to do with understanding both buildings and how they go up, and the building code. And when we're talking about specialized roles in Ontario, often what we're talking about is the ability to stamp a drawing. And I'm sure most people taking this will have at least heard of the concept of stamped drawings. Sometimes they can be required by your funder as a means of accessing funding. And what does it mean to stamp a drawing? What it means is that professional, and that's someone who has a kind of professional license or is managed by a professional association, and you see a number of those professional associations on screen in front of you now. And when they place their stamp on a drawing, they're assuming the liability for what's written there. They're saying that this drawing meets code and that any risk that is involved in putting up this building is guaranteed by them and their training to say that this is a good building, this will work. The next group of professionals that we want to speak about and the role that they play is building inspectors. And this is the person who's responsible for overseeing and reviewing both the plans before things start to get built, as well as conducting on-site inspections to ensure that what is being built by the contractor matches those plans or drawings that were signed off on by the architect. And that also requires that they comply with the relevant building code. And so on reserve, that will be the National Building Code, unless your community has passed a kind of separate bylaw to acknowledge a different building code. Another group of professionals who we want to talk about who are particularly relevant to this process, the process of tendering and procurement, are legal professionals. Throughout this course, there's going to be these moments where we identify the possibility of the need to consult a legal professional. They're able to review and confirm the documents, agreements, contracts, anything that you're entering into with someone external to ensure that the best interests of the owner, the First Nation in this case, are being protected. And so while sometimes when you think of a construction project, the first professional who comes to mind may not be a lawyer, particularly when we're thinking of tendering and procurement and the contract signing process that accompanies it, there's going to be a number of moments, especially when we move away from using standardized templates or existing agreements, where we are going to recommend that that you seek legal counsel. And you may hear me throughout this course offer the advice that I'm not a lawyer. And so while this course is designed to provide the best advice possible and best practices on tendering and procurement, I'm not a lawyer, and so there are places where I will suggest that you seek legal advice. Now, that's not the only people who may be involved in your project team. Depending on your context, your community's relationships, or your relationships with other professionals, it can be useful through a tendering and procurement process to work with other technical advisors, folks from your tribal council, your CMHC representative, or ISK regional office employees, or others who we may not be totally acknowledging here, but who may play an important role in your community's housing process. You may want to engage them to add skills and add specialized skills to your project team or to reduce risk. Now, having more people involved in a tendering and procurement process can produce higher quality outcomes by leveraging their specialized knowledge or their understanding of the industry. Totally. But there is a risk as your team grows and grows and grows that you can slow things down by just having too many cooks in the kitchen. So be careful as you add specialization to your project team that everybody being added has a clear function, a clear role, or a clear responsibility, and that they are contributing rather than slowing down the process. Well, now that you have a better understanding of some of the roles and responsibilities that will be taken up in tendering or procurement, we can keep asking and answering the questions that will lead us to tendering documents. Thanks.